Genesis chapter 1 and verse 9. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself, upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, and the herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. So last time we were finishing up on verses 9 and 10, which describe to us the first of the two events that take place on this third day of creation, that being the formation of dry land. Then verses 11 and 12 will give us the creation of vegetation, with verse 13, the fifth verse in this sub-series here, concluding the third day of creation. Verse 13 would be concluding the third day and the two events found in verses 9 and 10, then in verses 11 and 12. So we also were discussing last week the second day, and we were looking at verses 6 to 8, this expanse, which is the atmospheric expanse. It shouldn't be firmament in your Bible. It should be expanse. If you don't have that changed, it's about time to get that changed in your Bible, because if there's one thing the atmosphere is not, it's not firm. So it shouldn't be a firmament. It should be the expanse. The purpose of the expanse, or one purpose of it, remember, was to divide the waters below, the waters above. Now we've got the waters above placed up there where they need to be temporarily, and as Moses always does, once he mentions this twofold thing, then he leaves one and goes to the other one. He's not going to be talking about the waters above, but instead in verse 9 he comes to the waters below. And this of course goes on to the next day of creation, where he said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place." That simply means the watery place. Verse 10, with the plurality of the word seas, yamin, shows that it's not just one big sea, but you've got a plurality of seas or oceans here. Basically the four that we have today: the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Indian Oceans. That's not to mention any of the bays and seas and so forth that would be connected to alongside some piece of land. So if we've got a plurality of seas, the point being we've got a plurality of land formations here. There's no such thing as the one supercontinent that eventually broke up later into Laurasia and Gondwana land, the things that we covered last time. Now, even if people don't or have never heard of Laurasia or Gondwana land or Pangaea, most people still believe in the continental drift theory. So you just need to realize that's unscriptural, regardless of whether someone that presents that knows really what they're talking about, and about the supercontinent and the two proto or subcontinents. There's no such thing as a continental drift theory. One thing besides the plurality of seas here, the one thing that destroys that, of course, is the necessity of millions and millions of years for this to take place. If South America has been floating away from Africa westward on the rate of several centimeters, not inches, centimeters per year, then can you imagine how many years it's going to take to get to the place where it is today? And so just a little bit of study, not much, just a little bit of study in the chronology of the Bible will reveal right away that the earth and God's creation is not several million years old, it's several thousand years old. And we quickly mentioned the verse in, I believe, chapter 10. Verse 25, which is their one proof text They can't really use Genesis 1:9, where it says, let the waters be gathered together in one place, and that means we're going to have one dry land. Because, as I said, he goes on to put seas in the plural in Genesis 1:10, which would right away knock that argument out from underneath them. But they do have Genesis 10 and verse 25. And unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. But this we'll come to later on refers to chapter 11. Chapters 10 and 11, by the way, I'll just mention in passing here, are not placed here in chronological order. The first half of Genesis 11 comes way back at the very beginning of Genesis 10. And then the middle of Genesis 11 fits in various places in chapter 10. And then, of course, the end of chapter 11 should come after chapter 10. He's grouping the things together topically here. But don't think that we've got all these events, what we call in chapter 10 our table of nations. We've got all this taking place, and then after all that took place, then we've got chapter 11 and verse 1 that they're all of one speech. Because I think at least 3 times in chapter 10 it says that there's multiplied speeches already. So in other words, that we'd have to swap chapters 10 and chapter 11, at least part of it. Now, for several other references that refer to this same thing, Psalm 95 and verse 5, talking about this first half of the 3rd day of creation. Psalm 95 and verse 5, the sea is his, and he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. So that would refer back to the 3rd day of creation. And Psalm 24, verses 1 and 2. Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. For he hath founded it, the earth mentioned in verse 1, he hath founded it upon the seas and established it upon the floods. So there we've got the dry land. He's talking about the dry land there in verse 2 has been founded upon the seas or upon the water. He doesn't mean a flood there. It's just a poor translation. Both of these texts in the book of Psalms, chapter 24 and chapter 95, referring back to this first event here on the 3rd day of creation, where we've got dry land. And as I said, God is doing this, preparing the earth for the inhabitants that he's going to be placing on it. Now we come to verses 11, 12, and 13. We'll have to finish up the 3rd day of creation here this evening and then begin to look at some things on the 4th day. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. The earth brought forth grass, and the herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit after his kind, or yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good, and the evening and the morning were the 3rd day. Now, critics love to complain about verses 11 and 12. Don't we have a spectacle on our hands with this vegetation now growing in this huge swamp that we have? But remember back in in both verses, verse 9 and verse 10, in both places God calls this particular portion of the earth dry land. So it must have been supernaturally dried off in order to have all this vegetation growing. Because if you've got a whole planet that's been covered by water, and then all of a sudden you've got some dry land appearing somewhere in it, you would assume that that dry land must have risen up from underneath the water, and it would stay soggy and moist and wet and muddy for months and months, if not years and years. We don't even have the sun here to dry it out yet. But God calls it dry land, so he's performing some miracle here in completely drying off the land in a supernatural way. Because this is all going to take place here on the same day of creation. The dry land formed first, and already we're going to have vegetation growing in verses 11 and 12. So that doesn't even give us a day for the land to dry off. It has to be dried off supernaturally. Now, we have to stick in something here. This is one of the many things that you have to stick in that the Bible doesn't give you the count of. But whenever he forms the dry land in verses 9 and 10, it would be filled with all of the necessary minerals and nutrients and rocks and all types of things like this would have also been formed at that same time. The plants in verse 11 and 12 are going to have nutrients and these various minerals to begin to grow. So although it's not given us here in our account, we know that the earth would have already been saturated and filled full of the necessary nutrients and minerals. Now, there are a couple exceptions to that statement that we'll have to save until we get to the flood, but there would have been several things that would not have been present in the earth's surface, in the crust of the earth at this time, but that are formed later on. But you see all of your gold and silver and things like that, where do you find those created in Genesis 1? Well, you don't. But whenever he's making dry land, he must be making all the things that are going to go with dry land at the same time. Now, in verse 11, Moses just gives us a general overview by means of three categories of the various forms of vegetation that God puts upon the earth. Notice there in verse 11, he said, first of all, let the earth bring forth grass. Now, he's not giving us a modern botanical study here. He's just giving us a general overview of the type of vegetation that's being made here. First of all, let the earth bring forth grass. Secondly, let the earth bring forth the herb, yielding seed. Thirdly, let the earth bring forth the fruit tree, yielding fruit, whose seed is in itself. So you've got grass, herbs, and fruit trees. Now, he chooses these three things just to give us an overview of all types of vegetation that are created on this day. With the grass, you know what grass is. We would have various forms, simple forms of grass, lichens, moss, algae, all types of things like this, your simple things that would have come first. Then with the herb, that includes, it's used later on in Scripture, that includes your flowers, perhaps your small bushes and shrubs, along with all your vegetables. You see, tomatoes and watermelons and cantaloupe, they all have to be created sometime. And roses and daffodils and daisies, they all have to be made sometime. And here's where they're put in, right here. They'd be coming under the category of the herb. And then thirdly, a fruit tree. And of course that would include all other types of tree. Your trees that bear cones and nuts and things like this would all fit together at this same time. Now, verse 11 is interesting because we have the origin of life here for the first time now in verse 11. Excluding the angels, spiritual life there. We've had no life that's existed prior to this time. So verse 11, the second half of the third day is important because we have the origin of life. In a simple form, of course, not as complex as it will reach later on, going through your mammals on up to man himself. I suppose that most people feel here that the way it's worded in verse 11, and God said, let the earth bring forth grass, that this does not refer to creation here, but he's planted the seeds, perhaps, millions of years before this, and now he's simply causing them to germinate. This is one man's belief in this area, and he states this very explicitly. It cannot be shown from Scripture when life first appeared on earth or exactly how life first appeared. The idea that God miraculously created the first life form cannot be supported dogmatically from the Bible. It is possible that the first, simplest organisms developed from inorganic material by means of natural processes. Now, he's a Christian because he goes on to say this does, by no means does this lead us to any materialistic philosophy. But he says that God could have used natural processes, and what he means there is the germination of the seed. Now, look though in verse 11. Let the earth bring forth grass. This evidently happened at once. Whether there was a seed there or not is beside the point. Let the earth bring forth grass. Let the earth bring forth, you could read this in front of each one, the herb yielding seed. And then let the earth bring forth the fruit tree yielding fruit. Now at this particular moment of time, you have a full-grown fruit tree with a full-grown piece of fruit on it all at the same time. Because you see, it's from inside that piece of fruit that you're going to have a reproduction of that same type of tree later on. God's not going to continue to produce new trees all the time. He puts the power of creation or procreation within whatever particular organism that he's referring to here. So at this time, you just have from nowhere, it doesn't begin to grow. In other words, what I'm saying is you've got trees with no growth rings in them. Now, the appearance of age, the doctrine of the appearance of age is seen in the fact that when you look at the tree, it would appear as if it had been there for 20 years. But it had been there just a moment of time. It already has its full dress of leaves on it, as well as fruit that it has to contain on that, so that whenever this particular fruit form falls off, we'll be able to scatter the seed and produce other trees. Now this is what it says towards the end of verse 11. The fruit tree didn't say that it's going to, put forth some leaves, and then after several years, however long it takes for a tree to mature to produce fruit, it says that the earth brought forth at the same time the fruit tree, which also had fruit already growing on it at this same time. After his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. The earth brought forth grass, first category, and herb yielding seed after his kind. Second category, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. It's interesting that Moses gives us the origin of life on dry land as opposed to marine life, because all scientists argue that life had to begin in water, first of all. And the Genesis account always has it just backwards to what scientists insist that it must be. They insist that life must have begun in water, but God said life began on the dry land. And of course, what else we have here is this full-grown fruit tree that is a very complicated type tree. Something that's able to produce a banana or a pineapple on it. That's a very complex type tree. And it didn't take a long time for it to begin to evolve. Now, he's mentioning this particular kind, first of all, for that reason, because it's one of the most complex types of trees, and because guess what type of tree is going to appear over in chapters 2 and 3? The fruit tree is going to appear. Now, whether it's an apple or a banana tree, we don't know. Could have been a pineapple tree or maybe a pear. But we've got the fruit tree appearing later on in the Genesis account that'll figure in on man's temptation and fall. So we see a happy fruit tree in the beginning, and it's going to produce some sad results later on. Not God's fault or the tree's fault, but man. Verse 11 and twice in verse 12, we have the first 3 times out of 10 times in Genesis 1 where we see the phrase, after his kind. Genesis labors the point to prove there's no such thing as the evolutionary cycle. Everything produces after its kind. Not something producing something in an entirely different area or different realm. Verse 11 has it once, and verse 12 has it twice. The fruit, verse 11, the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind. Verse 12, the herb yielding seed after his kind, and then the tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. You see, when God goes to the trouble of mentioning that 10 times, it's rather repetitious here. 10 times in this one chapter. Really, it's not the whole chapter. It's just from verse 11 to verse 25. Really just the middle of the chapter. From verse 11 to verse 25, we have all 10 times where this phrase, after his kind, appears. Each animal, each fish, each bird, each species in the realm of vegetation is always producing after its own kind. Twice, verse 10, verse 12, he says it's good. Verse 13, the evening was, the morning was, day 3. That's rather simple to go over. Vegetation made here in the very beginning. So before man comes on the scene, we have an entire earth that is simply covered, and I mean from top to bottom, covered with plush, tropical vegetation. Not what we see today. Because Peter tells us in 2 Peter 3 that the earth that then was perished, being overflowed with water, but we have a new earth that we're on now. That is one that's been changed by the flood. So from what we call the North Pole to the South Pole is nothing but plush, tropical vegetation. The climate would have been a uniform climate. We like 70 degrees, so that's probably what it was, just for man, 70 degrees. And it would have been that way from the North Pole to the South Pole. You don't have any glaciers, you don't have any deserts, you don't have any what we call mountains today. You don't have any of those things. Hilly surface, low mountains, uniform topography from one pole to the other and from the east to the west. That's just covered. Not like a jungle that you can't walk through it, but I mean just covered. The ground would have been just covered. You wouldn't have come across places where you'd have a lot of dry and dusty ground there. You would have walked on this grass. By the way, this grass here in verse 11, and it's mentioned also in verse 12, it really carries with it the connotation of a wet grass, like you'd think of a mulch or a lichen. So the whole ground is just covered with mulch at this time in various forms of soft grass. Now, I trust you know enough from Genesis 3 to realize there are no thorns, there are no thistles, there's nothing like that in the earth at this time. It is a plush bed that you could lie down in, like a field of clovers. And this is the way God made it in the very beginning for man to enjoy. And this is what Isaiah 11 and Revelation 20 and 21 say that the earth will be restored back to the Garden of Eden conditions, that is the pre-fall conditions, where the lion will lay down with the lamb, and the ox and the leopard will eat straw together. The children will play at the hole of an asp. They'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and they'll learn war no more. So we'll be going back, that's Micah 4 and Isaiah 2 at the same time. We'll be going back to this early condition, a complete change. Now, we'll have to save that for another teaching, but the average Christian knows nothing about what the earth is going to be like whenever Jesus comes back and sets up his throne over there in Jerusalem. The average Christian doesn't have any idea what the earth is going to be like. He just pictures that things pretty much are going to run like ordinary, and you'll still go to work and get home, and if you want to see Jesus, then I guess you'll catch a flight and go to Jerusalem or something like that. Most of them, of course, are amillennialists. That means they don't believe in any literal millennium here on the earth. They believe that we're in the millennium right now. But if we're in the millennium, then there's a problem with Isaiah 11, because you won't see oxen and lions friends, except maybe in a circus or something. But you certainly won't see that today. Like the book of Zechariah teaches that the children will be able to play out in the streets. Well, you can't play in the streets today either. You get run over by automobiles. But Zechariah says there will come a time where the old men, the young men, and the little children can sit out and play in the streets. So we'll have a total change in economic and political and world conditions at that time. Many, many passages that refer to the millennial reign of Christ, where we'll see these things changed. And much of it, as I say, will go back to this original condition that we have here in Genesis, because there will be death. There is a possibility of death we see in several places, but that's only due to the fact that once man has a fallen nature, you can never change that. You can get rid of the tempter, which will be done during the millennium. Revelation chapter 20 says you can get rid of the tempter. And then people think, well, how can you have sin and death and evil if you don't have a tempter? You still got your human nature to deal with. And you've got people that'll be entering the millennium that won't be saved. And those that enter the millennium who won't be saved don't need anyone to tempt them. They've got self to tempt them. And so they'll be able to fall in that manner. But for the most part, we'll have the restoration of this type of condition that'll prevail throughout the earth. I guess most people don't really realize here in the very beginning what the earth actually looked like. If you don't think about it, and if you don't really study these things, then you just subconsciously, you picture the earth as it looks today. You think that the mountains have to look like they do today, and the Sahara Desert looked back then like it looks today, and you've got a North Pole and a South Pole and things like this. But just a superficial reading of Genesis shows you that couldn't be true. And a person who's just read these first few chapters of Genesis in Sunday school ought to realize that this type of earth God's talking about is not like the one that we live on right now. Couldn't be. That's how devastating sin is, dear friends. Amen. Romans 8, the whole creation fell. And it's wrapped up now in the bondage of decay and destruction. Romans chapter 8, verses 19 to 23. You can read it. The whole creation has fallen. So that means not only man, all Christians know what their pastors teach on, well, we're fallen creatures, but they think, well, birds aren't actually fallen, or animals, or trees, or the climate. But you see, more than just man has been changed and fallen as a result of sin, not only original sin with the case of Adam, but the great universal sin that was so prevalent in Noah's day. It's still sin all over again. Not original sin there, but sin that's widespread, going over all the earth. And God finally said that it repented him that he had even made man on the earth. And that, by the way, in Genesis 6 is the first place where the word grace appeared. And thank God for his grace that he had on Noah, or wouldn't have anyone existed. He'd just start all over again if he wanted to. That means none of us would have been here because we were all in the loins of Mr. and Mrs. Noah. Verses 14 through 19. Let's go on to our next day of creation then, because like the first day, we'll have to spend a lot of time here on the fourth day because we have a lot of material provided here. Verses 14 through 19. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of heaven to give light upon the earth, and it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, and he made the stars also. And God set them in the expanse of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening was, and the morning was, day 4. Okay, this brings us back to the second heaven. We haven't been dealing too much with that thus far. The second heaven, outer space, that would have been created back in verse 1, a place in which we can locate the earth, or God could locate the earth after creating it in verse 1. And since that time, we've not really seen much of it or had much to do with it. But on this fourth day of creation, in verses 14 through 19, we come full circle back to the second heaven, the universe, outer space, and now we have quite a lot of material dealing with this particular realm. It's hard to know where to begin on all this. Let's see. Well, I guess we'll just start here at the beginning, the very beginning of verse 14. God said, "Let there be lights." Now, all of this fourth day has to do with what we call the luminaries. That's what the whole fourth day is about. It's not about outer space itself, because outer space has already been created. But the whole subject of the fourth day of creation concerns the luminaries. Specifically mentioned here, the sun, the moon, and the stars, although other things would be included, as you'll see as we go along here. But specifically mentioned the greater light, which is the sun, the lesser light, which is the moon, and the stars, all found here summed up in verse 16. Back in verse 3, now we're going to have an abeyance of this temporary light source, whatever it was. Of course, we're not told. But whatever this light source was, we don't need it any longer, because we're going to have in verse 14, and God said, "Let there be lights," plural. So now we're going to have a plurality of the luminaries placed in the sky. As far as we are concerned, there are only two types of bodies. There are terrestrial and celestial. Mentioned, by the way, in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, the only terrestrial one is the earth. Now, the two planets that are a little bit closer to the sun than the earth, and then the Mars, one planet right past the earth, they are called terrestrial planets only because they have a solid makeup like the earth has. But they are celestial from our point of view because they're out in space. And if they're out in space, that makes them celestial right away. So the moon and your stars and all your planets and the sun and so forth are all going to be celestial bodies. The only terrestrial body is the earth. And I meant to give this later on, but I just want to give you some facts about the earth here quickly so we can go on and not have to cover this next time or whenever we're going to get to the earth. We still have more things to say about the earth under Noah's flood, but I just want to give you some basic statistics about the earth. It's not mentioned here now in verses 14 to 19 as being one of those things created. It's mentioned as the recipient of the light that will come from the things that are created. But the earth is the first of the bodies made, back in verse 1. So here are just some interesting facts that you might find interesting about the earth. First of all, it's covered by 71% water and 29% dry land. I forget what the figure is of this dry land. So just roughly a third of the earth is dry land, and it seems like something like 2/3 of that can't be inhabited. It's either a desert or a mountain or something in between that can't be inhabited. So we've only really got a third of the land area, dry land area, or any area really on the earth that we can dwell upon. Pushing out the borders nowadays. The earth turns on its axis, which we assume it began to do in the very beginning, every 23 hours and 56 minutes and 4.09 seconds. We call them 24-hour periods, but they're really 4 minutes short of that. It goes around the sun. The earth revolves around the sun once in 365 days, 6 hours, 9 minutes, and 9.54 seconds. Which one? Going around the sun? 365 days, 6 hours, 9 minutes, 9.54 seconds. The deepest place on the earth is called Challenger Deep in the South Sea, the South Pacific Ocean. It's 36,198 feet deep. West of the island of Guam. We fought an important World War II battle in Guam. That's the deepest place on the earth. Tallest place on the earth is Mount Everest on the border between Nepal and Tibet. 29,028 feet high. The hottest place is in the desert of Libya, 136 degrees. The coldest place is Antarctica, 127 degrees below zero. No wind chill there either. Interesting facts about this planet that we live on. We kind of live in between, I guess, the 136 and 127. But now going back to what I said earlier, we didn't have these extremes in the very beginning. You didn't have any such thing as 127 degrees below zero. And you didn't have 136 degrees above zero either. You had a tropical, uniform climate at this time. Yes? That's the coldest, yeah. The coldest. That they've measured anyway. It's been almost that cold around here. That's on the other end of the globe, too. See, it gets much colder in Antarctica than it does. It gets colder at the South Pole than the North Pole. Because remember, the northern hemisphere, in the wintertime, it's actually closer to the sun. We think of the north being cold, but really the south is much colder than the north is. You just got to go down on the other side of the equator and get down on the bottom of the globe. When you get to the South Pole, you're going to have colder temperatures than you'll have at the North Pole. All right, now I was going to say that later on, so we've covered that. We can skip over that when we get there. What we want to look at here this evening is the subject of space. This is that realm that God's talking about in verses 14 through 19, where he's going to place the luminaries. So before looking at the luminaries, we want to look at space itself. Now, we use this term, of course, synonymously with the term universe. When we talk about space or outer space, then we use it to refer to the universe, and this is how, of course, it's supposed to be used. But either word is okay. You talk about space, you talk about the universe. In both cases, in both instances, we'll know what you're talking about. There are two different types of galaxies that we find in the universe. The elliptical galaxies and spiral galaxies. Now, our galaxy is a spiral galaxy, and it's known as the Milky Way. Why do you suppose? Anyone know where we got the name the Milky Way? Because when you look towards the center of our galaxy, we're way out on one of the spiral arms. We're almost out, we're 30,000 light years from the center of our galaxy. Our solar system is 30,000 years from its center. So we're out on one of the edges of the arms of this spiral galaxy. And when you look back towards the middle, it looks like a milky haze there because you've got so many stars clustered together, and therefore they named it the Milky Way because it kind of looks like milk, a hazy color there. Now this is a different galaxy. Obviously, I can't show you a picture of the Milky Way galaxy because you'd have to be outside of our galaxy looking back at it before you can get a picture of our galaxy. But we can tell from observation, looking around at other parts of our galaxy, that we're a spiral galaxy, which would mean that we look exactly like this, which is the Whirlpool galaxy. Fascinating thing. But here in the very middle, that's not a sun, that's just billions and billions of stars that are clustered very close together. There in the very middle. And then around this middle, you have these spiral arms that all go out towards the same direction, and they all wrap back around the center of this galaxy. And these spiral arms here are themselves composed of billions and billions of stars. Now, our galaxy or our solar system would be located like way out on the very edge of one of these arms. And it would comprise, friends, looking at this, it would comprise nothing but one of these little dots on here. And that would be our whole solar system, which is comprised of the sun and the 9 planets here. And that would only be out here on a very far arm, and all of this would be the Milky Way. And then beside this would be another one, another whole galaxy here, and beside it another one, and you'd count trillions of those that would make up the universe. Why don't you pass that around? Bring it back to me. I think I've got another picture. But you might want to look at that. And we can tell that that's what our galaxy looks like, because since we are out on the very rim of our galaxy, we can get a good view of the rest of the galaxy. And since we're out there, we can look around and see those same spiral arms. Now, you can see these at night, sometimes on certain nights, where right across what appears to be the top of the sky, when you look up there and see those stars now, you are looking outside of our solar system, but you're looking inside our galaxy. Not very far away, in other words. And that's where most of those stars are, or all of the ones that you're going to see with the naked eye are going to all be right here in this galaxy. And if you look out on a certain night, you can see a very faint fuzzy band that goes from the east to the west. It goes right across the very top of the sky. And if you look at it too hard, you can't see it. It's one of those things that's so faint, you got to look at it and look away. Whenever you look at it and look away, you can see it. Now, if you sit there and stare at it, it'll disappear. You'll never see it then. But whenever you've got a clear night, and it just happens at certain times of the year, you can go and look at that, and that's one of those arms that you're seeing out there. And there's just dozens of those arms that are going to go out from this galaxy, each containing just thousands and trillions and billions of stars within it. And those will be stars so far away that they're just faint. They don't actually appear to be a speck like you can see whenever you look up and visualize stars in the sky. When you see those now, they appear actually as a little dot of light to you. But whenever you see this band here, it is so far away and so fuzzy that it appears just there again, you've got that creamy milky color there, for which they named this the Milky Way. Now I've got a picture of what our solar system looks like. Now you've got to remember that our solar system is it is so small it's unreal how small it really is. But yet you can fit in our solar system the sun, which is the very center of it, and the 9 planets which revolve around the sun. And in this little tiny speck, the solar system, you've just got trillions of those that are also inside our Milky Way galaxy, also either right in the center or out on one of those arms there, where you'd also have these clusters of stars grouped together. Now this is the only known planetary solar system that is in existence. If there is another one, we don't know of it. This is the only known planetary solar system. In other words, the only solar system that has planets in it. The rest of them are filled with comets and stars and your various other phenomena of the sky. But there aren't any others that we know of that contain planets like a Venus and a Mercury and Earth and Mars and these various things. Now the red dot in the very center represents the sun. I didn't want to write the names here, so I just numbered them. Your planets that go out from here. You've got Mercury, you go out to Venus, then Earth. So you see we're the third one closest to the sun. Before us, we've got Mercury and Venus. Right past us, we have Mars, which is the planet that's most similar to our planet, very similar to our planet. Does not have life on it and cannot support life, but it, of all the other ones, is the closest one to ours. Then these green dots that we have drawn in here, this is the belt of the asteroids. that comes between Mars and Jupiter. Now these are the things that happen to be located right in between these two planets, Mars and Jupiter, but you would not ever want to get your planet in the middle of this belt here, because those asteroids would simply annihilate any planet that got in the middle of them. They're swirling around at the same time, going around the sun. And if they ever crossed over and got in the path of one of these planets, or a planet crossed over and got in their path, they would annihilate it. We go on out to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus. Then Neptune wasn't discovered until several years ago, or not that long ago, I think last century, and Pluto just discovered this century. These were our last two planets, and Pluto is the last one that we know of, that we've been able to locate. They found both of these planets, your outside two, Neptune and Pluto, by means of the gravitational influence they had on Uranus. They could predict the type of orbit that Uranus ought to have around the sun. But at a certain time of the year, it would seem to take a funny motion. It would go a certain way that it had never gone before, and they just theorized there must be some type of body out beyond that that has a gravitational force that's causing it to move a little bit from what we would project that it would do. And once they found Neptune, it also had peculiarities, and so then we finally had to get out here to Pluto. Pluto is the one who has the strangest of the orbits. You can see right here that actually at one part of its orbit comes inside the orbit of Neptune. But it is the one who has the furthest reach away from the sun in our solar system. These numbers on the far right represent how many miles away these planets are from the sun. Mercury, 36 million miles.
For the continued